Chapter 41. Martin James knew that he wasn't at home when he saw the tree root rise out of the water, a strange, weathered thing that seemed capable of resisting repeated immersion. Above it, the trunk rose in defiance, reaching out towards the mild sunlight of an unusually balmy day. He stood at the edge of the waters of the Sound on a raised platform of boards, listening to the cry of a bird he did not recognize. Despite the fact that it was January, he wore only a light jacket over his t-shirt and jeans. Ffion Roberts stood by his side, similarly dressed. It was just after 9 o'clock in the morning, but jet lag left him still feeling tired. They had arrived in North Carolina late the night before, and his internal clock was still askew. A small motorboat chugged across the placid surface of the Sound, creating ripples that spread slowly towards them. Behind and to the side were 2 rows of neat cottages, a mixture of white painted wood and brick with matching picket fences. Martin looked at his watch, and they left the narrow jetty, turning once again towards the town proper. Again, he was struck by its picture book quality, an immaculate antique quaintness that probably hid a series of secrets, one of which was undoubtedly his own. They had decided to come to Gainsborough after Ffion Roberts had confirmed that was where his great-uncle, Josiah James, had settled after the Civil War. Following the death of David Young that night at Llyn Castle, and during Wyndham Spencer James's slow recovery, Martin had seen quite a lot of Ffion. Just before Christmas, about the time he had decided to grant Marion Keynes a short-term lease on Place Wenlas and keep the Apple House and adjoining building for his own use, Ffion had gone to Liverpool to search through the archives of the American Civil War. When she returned, she had told him she confirmed his great-uncle's involvement with blockade running, and finally, she knew where he had gone. She found his politics difficult, and it was unclear what the exact extent of Josiah's support for the South had been, but there was no hiding her excitement. So about 10 days ago, they had both decided to come to Gainsborough. Now Ffion stood by his side, clutching a folder of her research material, as they watched a slim African-American woman of medium height, wearing a lightweight but formal trouser suit in maroon, walk towards them. After Ffion and the African-American woman, whose name was Amisha Gray, had exchanged greeting, the latter turned towards Martin and said, "You must be Martin James." He admitted that he was, and she looked slightly sideways towards him, and she said, "And you've come to see the James house?" Martin nodded in reply. He didn't know what else to do. He hadn't expected that a house would be named after one of his ancestors. He hadn't known what to expect exactly. Everything was different here. The air smelled different. Even the water in the Sound looked unfamiliar. For a moment, he tried to imagine his great-uncle living here, but his imagination couldn't stretch that far. He didn't know what all the conditions would have been. Not yet. Martin and Ffion then followed Amisha Gray down the jetty and past a row of white-painted cottages until they came to a much bigger and obviously older house. 2 stories high, built of wood with classical proportions, a pillared porch and sash windows either side. The house bore a startling resemblance to a building they had left behind in Wales over 3,000 miles away. It was as if someone had redesigned Plaswen Las for the New World, Martin thought, and moved it nearer the water where it seemed to belong. It's one of the oldest buildings in Gainsborough, Amisha Gray said, confirming what Martin had been thinking. We're very proud of it. It now belongs to the Preservation Society and we're looking for a suitable buyer. Once inside the rather grandly proportioned hall, Martin could see that the house was in need of more attention than was apparent from the exterior. There were holes in some of the plastered walls, indicating that either something had been removed or that the house had experienced some fairly rough usage. The floors too were scuffed and battered, and in some places narrow boards that were obviously not original had replaced older, wider ones. Despite this, there was an airy lightness about the building that surprised him, and the curve of the staircase reached up from the ground floor in a majestic sweep that seemed to be in perfect proportion to the windows that sat either side of the front door. The whole effect was one of unusual harmony and grace. Late Georgian, I should think, round 1790, judging by the panelling. Ffion, who obviously knew her architecture, said. We call it federal, Amisha Gray said. But as fine as it is, I don't think you've come here to talk about architecture. Amisha Gray had a voice that Martin found easy to listen to. He liked her directness too. Looking round the worn but well-proportioned room, which was painted in an off-white that was in need of redecoration, he couldn't help comparing it with the drawing room of Plaswen Las, the room that had seen both the death of his Aunt Henrietta and of Queenie Rogers. But now there was no obvious horror, no bloodstains on the floor. What there was instead was a series of insidious questions. What kind of man had his uncle Josiah, who had traded on the side of the South in the Civil War, really been? Why had he exchanged one kind of elegance in a house in southwest Wales for a similar one, an ocean and a life away? He was about to ask Amisha Gray what she knew when she returned to the subject of the house for the moment. We think originally this room would have been much darker colour, kind of blue-green, Amisha Gray said. We sent the paint chips off for analysis. Martin stood there dumb for a moment. The sense of duplication and displacement was confusing, the combination of intimate detail and larger, unanswered questions too much. He tried to attribute what he was feeling to jet lag, but he knew that was only partly correct. The very nature of the whole series of transactions that had brought him and his great-uncle to North Carolina bothered him. What made you decide to name the house after Josiah James? Ffion asked Amisha Gray suddenly. He couldn't have bought it until the 1860s, and it was built a long time before then. It's not named after him, Amisha Gray said. It's named after her, Hannah James. He left the house to her when he died in 1870. She became one of the first African Americans to own significant property in Gainsborough. She could read and write. She started a school in her own front room. That's why we're so proud of her. But who was she? She was Josiah James's housekeeper, and some people think she was a lot more than that. But first of all, she started off as his slave. You mean he bought her? Fion's question startled Martin and brought him suddenly back to himself. Amisha Gray nodded. The records are quite clear. Josiah James purchased Hannah in 1861, just before the Civil War broke out, and 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. She was 20 years old. And he was over 60, Ffion Roberts said. She glanced at Martin and then at the folder she was carrying. If you say so, Amisha Gray said. His age is immaterial. She was his absolute property. He could do with her what he liked, and we think he did. He wasn't the first. Martin James now knew that the bare elegance of the room concealed another, uglier secret. The perfectly carved mantel above the fireplace, the almost perfect classical proportion of the panelling, bore witness to something far more sinister. But she stayed with him after the emancipation, Ffion asked. Amisha Gray nodded. We don't know why exactly. Her inner workings are blank. We don't even know her real name, her slave name. That would have been known only to her friends. We know her by the official record and a photograph. That's all. But that she managed to survive and found a school during the period is significant. More than one could expect. Did she marry again? Only much later. She had one more child. My great-grandfather. That's why I feel so connected to her, Amisha Gray said. But now I have something else to show you. She turned and led them out of the room and up the curved staircase to a room near the top of the house. It was obviously used for storage. There was a jumble of tables and chairs turned on their sides, and various other objects covered with dust sheets. But there, on the wall opposite the window, was a framed, oval, photographic portrait of a woman dressed in a long skirt and high-neck blouse. Her hair was pulled back from her face in a kind of French roll. We've moved everything up here for safekeeping, Amisha Gray explained, while repair work is being carried on downstairs. Martin and Ffion stopped in surprise before the photograph. Hannah James stood in a formal pose with her left hand resting on what looked like the stump of a classical pillar. There were similarities with the portrait of his great-uncle that Ffion kept above her desk at home. Both of them knew this, and there was no need to mention it. But she's... Martin began. Amisha Gray interrupted him. Almost white, yes. That's why she cost him so much. Hannah James was a quadroon, that is, only one of her 4 grandparents was black. If she had any children with Josiah, they would have been even lighter, but we have no evidence that she did. Martin turned to look at Ffion Roberts, who, after staring at the portrait of Hannah James for a moment, reached into the file that she had brought with her from Wales. I think we do, she said quietly. She searched for a moment and then brought out a copy of a tinted photograph. It showed a woman in her late 30s or early 40s at the turn of the 20th century. The blouse and the skirt and the features were similar to those in the other photograph. It was Martin's Aunt Henrietta. I'd like a copy of that, Amisha Gray said immediately. I think we now know what must have happened, Ffion Roberts said. It's been bothering me a long time. I've always wondered why Josiah James left his children behind in Wales. But it wasn't like that. It was the other way round. He had 2 children here in North Carolina with his housekeeper, who had originally been his slave. By the laws of the time here, his children would have been classified as black. But they were light enough to pass as white. So he sent them home to be taken care of, and the house he bought for them to live was Plaswen Lass. He sent them over, and he never saw them again. Martin James turned to face Amisha Gray. If what Ffion says is true, then that would make us relatives, he said. Welcome to Gainsborough, Amisha Gray said.